And this afternoon, our panel of Year 5 students has the honour of interviewing the Executive Director of Catholic Schools for the Archdiocese of Sydney, Dr. Dan White. We wish to discuss two items. One, his pilgrimage to Italy, Turkey and Greece, and second, his visit to the Catholic schools of the Wilcannia Forbes Diocese of New South Wales. Good afternoon, Dr. Dan.
Good afternoon.
And thank you for giving up your time and allowing us the opportunity to interview you.
It's a pleasure. Lovely to be here.
We see that you are a very busy man. Now over to our panel for the first question.
Last term you went on a pilgrimage called In the Footsteps of St. Paul with Cardinal George Pell and some teachers.
The pilgrimage took you to Greece, Turkey and Rome as you walked in the footsteps of Jesus' apostle St. Paul.
You also visited the Italian town Assisi, where St. Francis came from, as well as attending the dawn service at Gallipoli in Turkey on Anzac.
Wow, Dr. Dan, what was it like? It must have been terribly exciting and quite moving.
Look, the whole pilgrimage was just a fantastic experience. Right from our very first Mass, we went to Corinth, and Corinth is where St. Paul first went to preach the Gospel, and that was a very beautiful, ancient place. But some of my special memories were going to the dawn service at Anzac Cove, and to be there just as the sun was starting to rise over the water and they played our national anthem. I never thought I'd start to cry when we sung our national anthem, but when you remembered the hundreds and thousands of men that died fighting there, you couldn't help but be moved. But what really made me much happier was the fact that today, nearly 100 years later, the Turkish community and the Australian community came together, and we actually celebrated the sacrifice that both countries made, because for the Turkish people, they were defending their country. They were doing what they thought was right, and the Australians and the New Zealanders were doing what they thought was right. But I think today we realise that war is not the solution to the world's problems. But nonetheless, we recognise just the sacrifice that those people made. I think one of the other highlights was that when we got to Rome, we were able to have a very special Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, right down just near where St. Peter is buried. Underneath the big church there's some little chapels downstairs, and we had a beautiful Mass there. And then when we came up from the Mass, Cardinal Pell took our group of teachers out, and we went out through the front door, and then there were hundreds and thousands of people had gathered in the big square to have an audience with the Pope. And then we sat down near the front. We had the very front seats, and the Pope came and he spoke to everyone that was there. And then at the end of that, Cardinal Pell took myself and my wife and a couple of others up to actually meet the Pope in person. So I actually got to shake hands and talk to Pope Benedict. And so that was a very, very special memory, to realise that I was shaking hands with the successor of St. Peter and the head of our church. And then finally, my most favourite, the most beautiful place was to visit Assisi. And as you said, that's where St. Francis was born and raised and lived his life. And I came to realise just how important it was, the very simple message of St. Francis. And that was that message of peace, that we really are only going to grow in love of God if we can be at peace with one another. So yes, the whole trip was just magnificent.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. What a memorable experience. Now to our second question.
Dr. White, you spent the last week of term 2 visiting Catholic schools in the Wilcannia Forbes Diocese in New South Wales.
We understand that That trip was to visit to see if a partnership between that diocese and our own Sydney diocese, particularly the Eastern region, under the leadership and support of our regional director, Mrs. O'Carrigan, could be developed.
This excites us greatly, Dr. White, as we would very much like to participate in a connected learning project with at least one of the schools in the Wilcannia Falls Diocese. We could connect using 21st century tools such as Skype and blogging, maybe even quad blogging if more schools were interested. In this way, we could share our learning about the topics we are studying as we learn from one another and with one another. Our question to you, Dr. Dan, is do you think connected learning with a school in Wilcannia Falls Diocese and us is possible?
What a great question. That was really one of the reasons why we did visit those schools, because if we form a partnership with some of those schools, they are very isolated. It took, for example, 2.5 hours to drive just to one school, and then another 200 kilometres before we got to the next school. They're a long way apart, and they are in very, very isolated areas of New South Wales. The children are fantastic. They're so energetic and they love learning. They're really good with technology, but the big problem that we were looking at is whether they've got enough broadband capacity to be able to do video conferencing and Skype and blogs with other schools in Sydney. We really do hope that we can have a connected community, but one of the things I was trying to find out is whether the government is providing enough broadband to those very isolated places to allow the sort of connections that we're looking at to take place. And the good news is in most of the schools we're going to put in video conference facilities for the children, and that will give them the opportunity to connect in with kids in the eastern region. And there was one town in particular that I'd love your school to connect in with. One of the towns was a town called Cobar. And why Cobar was special is that it was where my mother was born. And it was my mother's hometown. She grew up in the country. And I still had some relatives there in Cobar. So if your school maybe in the future could connect in with the school in Cobar, that would be really exciting.
Thank you.